Today we're going to talk about the science of persuasion. A lot of times we listen and we hear the word the art of persuasion, but there's actually also a science of persuasion. And what we're going to do in the next 45 minutes is to look at some approaches to persuasion. We are going to look specifically first at persuasion. What is persuasion? Why we need to persuade, and how we need to persuade. Now we're going to look at the science, meaning I'm going to provide you with a framework for you to be able to approach persuasion, especially in the context of negotiation. Waktu kita nego, a lot of people just go there and nego without thinking, tanpa planning, tanpa thinking of an approach of how we want to persuade the other party about what we want so that we get what we want. And tonight, malam ini kita akan look and bahas 6 different approaches. And if you look at my slide, these are the approaches. Let me just read these approaches first. First, a Rogerian approach to persuasion. If you've never heard of a Rogerian approach, no worries. Saya yakin by 8 o'clock you will be experts at a Rogerian approach, because a Rogerian approach is usually the way we use to actually persuade the other party to agree with what we want. There's a second. This is called a needs and desire approach. The third approach we'll be looking at tonight is the 7 C's of communication approach. Now, 7 C's communication approach, biasanya itu untuk top down. So if you're the leader of your team and you want to persuade your team about something, we usually suggest you pakai the 7 C's of communication approach. Then we have dari 2,500 tahun dahulu, Aristotle. And Aristotle's way to persuade people is called rhetoric. And he uses something called ethos, pathos, and logos. So we're going to look at that approach to persuasion. There are 2 more approaches that we're going to look at. The first is a spin, value, and solution approach. And this is very good, especially in a situation where you're trying to persuade other people in a team. And the last approach we're looking at is what's called the Cialdini proof approach. Okay? Don't worry if you don't know all of these terms. I'm sure that by 8 o'clock tonight, you will be an expert in persuasion. So are we ready? I hope you are. Let's start looking at some approaches. So the first question is, what is persuasion? What does it mean to persuade someone? I'll just let you think about it for a moment. And I want you to quickly take out your Google, either on your laptop or your handphone, and start Googling persuasion. What is persuasion? So I'll just give you 30 seconds. Tolong. Google persuasion. What do you see on Google? I'll give you half a minute. Go ahead, everyone. This is what I found. Persuasion is a process. So it's a process. It doesn't happen automatically. Persuasion is a process where one person tries to influence another person or group of people And what are they trying to achieve? You're trying to change their belief or behavior. Kalau semua sepakat, you don't need persuasion. But we know that in reality, di realitas, you never have 100% consensus. You always will have people who disagree, people who want to do it differently, mau cari cara yang lain daripada yang kita mau. And what we want to do is to persuade them that by influencing them to see my way is the better way. So let's start. Look at when you persuade. I'm sure hari ini aja. Pasti you've had many chances where you tried to persuade someone. Maybe I tried to persuade my wife not to buy something. Maybe you had to persuade your children not to do something or to do something. Sometimes every Sunday I have to persuade my children to go to church. All kinds of things. Every day we are persuading. As human beings in society, kalau ada dua orang, pasti ada perbedaan pendapatnya, and there will be a need to persuade. Maybe end of the year is coming. Maybe a teacher wants to go and see Miss Eiling and say, "Ma'am, can I have more salary? Naik gaji?" I don't know. Everyone is persuading. And why you need to understand an approach is so that you can be consistent. You know what you're doing when you are dealing with the other person. And that's what persuasion and what tonight's session is about. So let's not waste time because we have 6 different approaches. So we know what persuasion is, and we know why we need to persuade. And we also now know that if you have a structure, kalau kita ada framework atau structure for negotiation, you usually get what you want. When you just go in and, I think the Indonesian word is jebleh. You know, you go in and you just say what you want. You usually don't get a good outcome. Good negotiators, good persuasion, people who can persuade well, do a lot of thinking. Pikir dulu sebelum we start the negotiation. We never just negotiate. It looks very relaxed, but there's a lot of pikiran sebelum you start the negotiation. So let's look at our first approach. Now, our first approach to negotiation is called the Rogerian approach. The Rogerian approach. And the Rogerian approach is an approach to negotiation or persuasion by a psychologist. It's actually the name of a person, and his name is Carl Rogers. He's a psychologist. And in this Rogerian approach, the method is to identify comparable perspectives between opposing viewpoints. Saya mau hitam, dia mau cat putih. We try to paint the wall gray, a middle ground. Now, ini beda sekali from an adversarial approach. Many times, we persuade by telling the other person why, kenapa approach saya lebih bagus, plan saya lebih bagus, dan plan Anda itu salah. It always ends up a debate. If you listen very carefully to two people trying to argue and negotiate, a lot of times approach mereka itu, plan saya bagus, plan kamu tidak bagus. And it ends there. Now, in the Rogerian approach, what we are looking for is common ground. You're always looking for what we have in common. And if you're trying to persuade the other person, you stay away dari hal-hal that are deal breakers. Biasanya dipanggil deal breakers. Things that tidak bisa dinego. So you stay away from the deal breakers and you try to find the common ground first. And you agree and you agree and you agree. Now, according to the Rogerian approach, what happens is that both parties, from his research, both parties start to have a different attitude to each other. There is a build-up of trust because at some point of time, both parties are going to say, padahal kita itu sama ya, we have the same goal, we have the same tujuan. Ayo kita bekerja sama. And this Rogerian approach is very, very helpful when you have equal parties. Kalau parti A sama parti B itu equal bargaining power, the Rogerian approach is very, very effective. Now, let me say a few more things about the Rogerian approach. It's always about finding the common ground. And according to Roger, Dr. Roger, he found that the sweet spot, yang manis, is when both parties express what he calls the common axis. Kalau dua-dua at some point of time, ya benar ya, kita dua-dua benar, tujuan kita sama. Now that is where you want to go. That is what you want to work to in the Rogerian approach. And what we are doing is, effectively, what we are doing is acknowledging the validity of each point. So, waktu kita dengar, and it's something that is correct, when you repeat it back to the other person, and we say, yep, I understand how you feel. I agree with you. Saya setuju sekali. Ya, ini masalah yang benar-benar susah. When you are using terms like that, what you are doing is creating dialogue yang productive. And when you start a productive dialogue, it is easier to persuade the other party to agree to you. Okay? So the Rogerian approach, bukan rencana saya bagus, rencana Anda tidak bagus, dan rencana saya lebih bagus dari rencana Anda. That is the traditional way of negotiating and persuading. The Rogerian approach says, mari kita lihat sama-sama apa yang kita berdua have in common. What do we agree on first? And that's the basis of the persuasion. Right. Number one, Rogerian approach. Let's go to approach number two. In approach number two, the approach that the persuader wants to take is to do analysis of needs and desires. What does the other person perlu dan apa yang mereka mau? And you're always thinking about the needs and desires of the other party when you want to negotiate or persuade in a situation, again, where both parties have almost equal bargaining power. And this is what it means. The first and always most important thing in needs and desires is to keep your big mouth shut. Don't talk. In fact, when I was a very young man, my mentor told me, listen more than you talk. always the first person who talks is the one who will lose the negotiation. Will lose. Let the other side talk first. The first point is always listen. So you listen to the opening, listen very carefully, active listening, and try to understand what is the need of this person. What does this person actually want? Sometimes it's very difficult because we are human beings and sometimes kita bawa excess baggage. Sometimes we are tired. Sometimes we got off a long flight and then this person wants to negotiate. You got no time. You're thinking about your family at home. And you have to go and negotiate with some guy who's being very difficult. Very difficult. Sit down and listen. And it's the biggest, most important skill if you want to be a good persuader. Bukannya bicara dulu, dengar dulu. Listen to the other counterparty. What else do you need? After you listen, you are listening to hear what is their need. You are trying to identify, ini sebenarnya mau apa sih? Dan gali. Don't just, oh saya mau more salary. Mungkin more salary itu kenapa? Why does he need? Is he planning to get married? Is the person trying to have bought a car? Is somebody in the family sick? Why? You want to understand what is the need of the person. And most of the time, 90% of the time, itu discovernya, di subtextnya. So when someone says, I want more money, it's not necessarily, I want more money. It's not just that. The question is why. Somebody says, I want to organize it this way. I want the competition to be organized this way. Ask yourself, why is this person saying this? Apakah itu karena ego? Apakah itu karena benar-benar cara dia lebih bagus? Or is something that's been tested before and they know this is the way to do something? Always identify the need of the other person. Next thing you do, you ask questions to clarify. You question like, why? What do you mean? Really? Can you give me an example? What happened next? Do you mean to say that this is what's happening? You're always asking questions. You listen, identify the needs, and then ask questions about goals. Why? Why? Yang penting itu kenapa? Kenapa? Why are you saying this? Why are you doing this? Why are you suggesting this? Why do you need me to decide on this, right? So asking questions about goals and challenges. And then you clarify to the other side. Apakah ini maksudnya? Apakah ini yang dimaksudkan Bapak? Apakah ini yang dimaksudkan Ibu? And you ask the other person to confirm. Now, every time they confirm, they're actually putting themselves in a box. Because, you know, you are taking the needs, framing it in a certain way, and orangnya akan have to say, yes, I agree. Ya, itu Pak, benar-benar begitu Pak, itu masalahnya, atau itu kondisinya. And they are boxing themselves in, and you can ignore all the things yang di luar kotak itu. So we just have to look at a smaller problem than a bigger problem. And that makes negotiation and persuasion a lot easier. And then you summarize a common understanding. So at the end of all these needs and desires, then you summarize. And the person who is negotiating with you usually is already happy that you dengar. The fact that you dengar the person is 90% of sudah happy, right? And then you come up with a solution that both parties can work with. I'm looking at my time, my watch, and I see that I'm taking a bit too much time. There's a very short 45-minute speaking time. So let's look at the third approach. Now, this is for all the bosses and the leaders, because this approach works best kalau there is a hierarchy. When we're the boss or kita atasannya, oh, you cannot hear me, or it's back again. Kalau kita atasannya, it's very important when you're persuading your team why you are doing something or apa keputusannya. We do what's called the 7 C's of effective communication. This is not original from me. 7 C's, if you Google it, you'll see a lot of material online about the 7 C's of communication. And here on the screen, you can see them. And we'll just take a minute to go through them so that at least once we understand that this should be the right way or the right framework to communicate with people in your team, especially if you are the atasan. Okay? The first thing you can see here is correct. What you are saying must be correct. For trust issues, you do not lie. You must always be correct. And then your message must also be complete. Banyak sekali examples, ya, contoh-contoh. Kita dapat informasi yang sedikit sini, disobek sana, little bit of this, little bit. People don't have complete. People sometimes don't give you complete information. Nanti kita, when we come back again and negotiate and say, look, this is what we're doing, there is a mismatch antara what you want to say and what is produced by the other side. So sometimes the communication is incomplete. Communication and messages must also be concrete, must be very clear. Try not to say maybe, mungkin, if. These are very difficult words to understand. It needs to be concise. It needs to be short. And why short? Because the human brain itu tidak begitu pintar. When you give me 10 messages, I can only remember maybe 1.5 messages. Like Tuhan gave 10 commandments. Kita biasanya cuma remember 3 atau 4. 6 kita lupa. Apalagi kalau bos bicara. Ya, 90% of what the boss says in persuading you is lost. So the less, the shorter, the clearer the communication and the message, the easier it is to persuade. Use slogans. Use slogans. Like, for example, in my school, we used to have a slogan called students first. So simple, 2 words, 2 kata aja. Students first. Teachers, everything nanti. Anak-anak dulu, diterutamakan. And we used to use a very simple slogan, students first. Very concise messages. Your message must also consider everything. When people hear your boss speak, and you do not refer, ya, tidak ada referensi ke pendapat of the workers and the bawahan don't feel that you have considered their opinion. And it's very difficult to accept, to be persuaded by a boss whose message doesn't consider your perspective or the other person's perspective. At all times, you need to be courteous. Itu cek yang sometimes we forget. Okay, so clear, correct, complete, concrete, concise, consider, courteous. Communicative approach, very, very good for when you have a hierarchy, when you're the boss trying to persuade your bawahan to do something or to agree to some kind of campaign, or you're trying to influence the way that they are going to do some project or task. Communicative approach, number 3. Let's go to the next approach. And the next approach is more than 2,500 tahun old, but still good, oldie but goodie. Our dear friends Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. So Aristotle came up with what is called rhetoric. I'll say the word again, rhetoric. So I'm sure there are people di room ini, di Zoom meeting ini, yang lebih pintar about Aristotle. I never did philosophy, but if you did philosophy, please nyaut and tell me whether I'm right or wrong. Now, his approach to persuasion is that there are 3 things you can use. And he calls them ethos, pathos, and logos. Now, what does this man who lived 2,500 tahun before can teach us today in 2023? Okay, he teaches us that good persuasion, or when you want to persuade, requires certain elements. And he broke down the elements into these 3 things: ethos, pathos, and logos. Let's start with ethos first. Ethos is not actually ethics, yeah, bukan ethics. Ethos is the credibility of you as the persuader. And Aristotle famously said, when you start the negotiation, the first thing you must do is to have your toga put on properly. Right? The toga was the Greek baju. If you come like a Vietnamese, it's very difficult to establish credibility. Now, in the 21st century, credibility is established different ways. Bisa reputasi, bisa baju, bisa the company you work for, bisa the title, bisa the card that you give, the car that you drive. And this is all about establishing your credibility so that when you talk, people listen. And more important, that when you talk, people follow. Bukan cuma listen, tapi ikut and believe you. So credibility is about trustworthiness, about reputation, the way you talk, and the style in which you talk. So ethos is one of the elements that Aristotle says is very important for persuasion. Then he also talks about logos. And of course, we are at the LTI meeting. So logos is logic, the reasoning that you are giving. There needs to be good, common sense reasons why the other side should adopt your belief. Why should the other, your counterparty, agree to your plan? Okay, and that's important. What is usually required are facts, figures, or history. Facts, bring your facts, fakta, bring your statistics if it's relevant, and explain, give examples. This is called logos. Now, the last is called pathos, and if you just look at the board, you can see it's emotional and stories. He found, Aristotle said, very famously again, emotions. When people like you, they actually will lose the negotiation. And I find that as well. Itu pendapat saya dan pengalaman saya. When I like the person, walaupun I think it's stupid plan, and you know, it's like, I shouldn't do this. Tapi saya, ya okay lah, if you want to do it, just do it. It's okay. Because I like the person. And that's the pathos. So for Aristotle, ethos, pathos, and logos. A combination of the 3 is a very good approach, a very, very good approach to getting what you want when you want to persuade. Okay, let's go to the last two. The next approach, approach number 5, this is called the spin approach. And the spin approach is very, very effective in the context of a workplace. So if you are working in a school or a factory or a production or a professional firm, yeah, you're doing business, you're doing work, there is a spin approach. Now, when we are persuading or negotiating for spin, SPIN stands for very specific things. S stands for situation. P is for the problem. I is implications. And the N is what we call the needs payoff. Atau kalau kita ikut rencana saya, apa yang kita akan dapatin? What is the benefit? Keuntungannya apa? Okay? So when we are presenting persuasion, we are presenting something, we want to persuade the other person to agree with you. If you don't know what to do, this is a very easy approach to take. First, you explain the situasi. Bu, begini. Ini. Then, Bu, ini masalahnya yang tertimbul. Masalahnya begini. Then you say, kalau kita tidak mengatasi masalah ini akan terjadi. Ini akan akibatnya, dampaknya ke sini, dampaknya ke sana. Okay. Then you enter your solusi. Solusi kita yang saya think is a good way to solve this problem adalah ini. Dan ini keuntungannya. That's the needs payoff. So a spin approach is a very simple way to organize your presentation. Situation first. Tell the other party your problem. Say what is the dampak, what is the implications. Present your solution. And then say, what's the keuntungan of following your particular solution. What this makes people feel is that they are all part of a team. At the end of the day, the more you do the spin approach, research shows that the team will start to trust each other. Because the feeling you get when you hear someone present the spin approach adalah this person sudah pikirkan semuanya. I can trust this person, and the level of trust between members of your team increases, naik. Kepercayaan antara satu anggota dengan satu anggota itu increase because we all talk the same language. Cara kita approach, the way we persuade is not emotional at all. There is no emotion. Remember our Aristotle, pathos, full of emotion. Oh, do it because you love me. Not because it's logical, because you like me, because you owe me, you must follow me. This spin approach is very, very unemotional. Situation, this is the problem. If you don't solve this problem, this is the akibat and the implications. This is my solution. This is the keuntungannya. Very, very business-like, and there's very little emotion in a spin approach. Now let's go. We just have enough time to do the last approach. I know there's a lot of information. As I said, I will send you this particular PowerPoint later. The last approach is called Cialdini's social proof. Okay? Cialdini's social proof is a very, extremely useful way, right? When you're trying to persuade a big crowd of people. And Cialdini is also a writer and a speaker. And this is the principle of Cialdini's social proof. there on our deck. Social proof says the greater the number of people who find any idea correct, the more the idea will be correct. Jadi, as more and more people agree that this is the right way to do, there it is easier to persuade your audience that ini benar-benar caranya. For example, all the schools are doing it. So, Temasek should do it. There must be a reason why everybody is doing it. Okay. Now, there are downsides to this. There are downsides to Cialdini's social proof. One important downside is to remember that everyone in the world, the bumi, once thought that the world was flat. Right? That the world is flat. Everybody thought that the world was flat. And we know that the world is not flat. So, just because everybody believes something doesn't necessarily mean it is the correct way. And that's the downside of Cialdini's social proof. But his theory holds water, that if 99% of people say, this is the way, ini caranya, and you go to your audience and say, 99% merasa ini yang benar. Jadi kita ikut aja ya. I can guarantee you, your whole audience will say, ya benar-benar. Because 99% of people can't be wrong. And if they are wrong, I'm also wrong. So we all die together. It's the correct decision to take. So that's Cialdini's social proof. And it's the sixth way of actually persuading people. Persuading your audience that this is what everybody thinks. Bring lots of examples, bring lots of research, bring lots of anecdotal stories that show that what you want people to believe is the correct belief. Now, he talks about social proof and his principles, and he gives certain principles like commitment to the idea. Reciprocity means I believe you, you believe me. There's a consensus. Everybody agrees on the same principles, and it goes on and on. Okay, it's a very interesting, newer way or approach to persuasion. I don't necessarily agree with many of the things that he says in his book and his research, but I leave it to you to decide whether it is any good for you, okay, whether you agree or you disagree with the way in which he frames persuasion. Okay, let's look at the 6 approaches again. First approach is Rogerian approach, very different from the traditional. This is where you find the middle ground approach. Then we look at persuading by listening to needs and desires. You listen and look at the needs and desires of the other person. And then you try to get that person to see that your plan, rencana kita, actually satisfies that person's needs and desires. Walaupun itu bukan yang mereka mau di initial, ya di awalnya, tapi my plan will also satisfy your needs and desires. That's number 2. Then we looked at the communicative approach, very important, where you have hierarchy. So when you're looking at this, you can research, go to Google, just Google it. There's a lot of material on Google. The 4th approach we looked at was Aristotle, our oldest approach to persuasion. He says credibility, logic, emotion. Then we looked at a spin approach. And the spin approach was always starting by explaining the background, the problem, the implication, and the needs. What's the keuntungan of what you are proposing? And the last is, of course, Cialdini's social proof. Now, where do you go from here? Now, let me just say that there is not just one approach. And these approaches are like a spectrum. Okay, so some of the approaches have overlaps. Is there an approach that is better or worse? I don't think so. If you ask me later, which you think is the best approach, I don't have an answer, because it depends on who you're trying to persuade, and it depends really on the situation and your relationship with the other person, the other counterparty. So it depends on a lot of things. But what is important is that I hope that this evening you've opened your mind a little bit, becoming a bit more aware, kesadaran, that when we are negotiating or persuading the other side, it's not just jabler. It's not just going in to negotiate. It is really thinking about the different approaches you can take sebelum you start negotiating or before you start persuading. Okay. And the other thing I would say is that the more you do this, semakin lama, the better you get with experience. So I rather have I don't like persuading old people, because old people have very set ideas and they know how to negotiate. They know what they want and they are very hard to move. Okay. So I like younger people, because when I'm negotiating younger people, sometimes you can, persuade them a little easier than you can persuade old people. And there is no substitute for listening. And always be prepared for your persuasion or your negotiation. It is not just go in and negotiate. It's not go in and try to persuade. Before you start your speech, before you engage with your counterparty, stop and think, what approach do I think will be the best? And be prepared. Prepare your notes, prepare what you want to say before you start persuading the other side. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the science of persuasion. Thank you very much for listening to me.